Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm very excited about tonight's event entitled Promoting Peace in a Time of War, a diplomat's journey from Cuba to Mali to the United Nations with Ambassador Bisa Williams here on the Dartmouth campus. One small note of logistics. As a completely precautionary measure, we have had to move this a bit to a hybrid. So I will be discussing with Ambassador Williams her experience and opening up the questions. As you can see, she's on the screen with us today, just one floor upstairs in Haldeman Hall. But we welcome all of those who have joined us both online and here with us. I'm Victoria Holt. I'm the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding. The Dickey Center is committed to upholding our founder's vision. The former president of Dartmouth often would remind students that the world's problems are our problems, and there's nothing that better humans cannot address. And it's very much in that spirit that I want to thank the class of 1950 and their fund, the Senior Foreign Affairs Lecture Series and Discussion for tonight's event, and actually for Ambassador Williams' 2.5-day visit across campus. She has met with students, with faculty, with people in administration. I think she's on a podcast. She has not slept since she arrived here Sunday evening. And I'm extra pleased to welcome representatives of the class of 1950. We have with us Dr. James Strickler, his wonderful wife, Peggy Strickler, and their fine colleague, Charlie Buell, who is a deep friend of Dartmouth, I understand. So thank you for joining us and representing the spirit of your class and of this lecture. The lecture's been given by a wide range of prominent diplomats, and I'm pleased to say they include former career diplomat and former Deputy Secretary of State, Bill Burns, who today is actually running the CIA for the Biden administration. We've also had Francis Elmer, the former Lieutenant Governor of Alaska, who, while working at Harvard, was focused on climate change. And also Lisa Monaco, a former Homeland Security and Counterterror Advisor in the Obama administration, today the Deputy Attorney General of the Department of Justice. So Bisa, no pressure about what you will do following this lecture. I am actually really excited about having her on campus as a role of a diplomat who's crossed continents, from Latin America and the African continent to the halls of the United Nations as a negotiator and diplomat, working at the White House and on the 7th floor of the State Department. But what I get from her speaking to us is also her love of being out in the field, for doing things that matter. She's less interested, perhaps, if I may say, in the stuffiness of particular floors of the State Department and more interested in the dirt on her shoes from getting things done. And I also want to say, in tackling the enduring questions of how does diplomacy work, what works, what doesn't, what are the tools we need for the future, perhaps just mention why I think this is particularly topical today. Many of us are focused on the headlines of what's happening in Ukraine. And the open question is there a peace to negotiate that could stabilize and end the violence? Is there a way to root the fights going on into a political, not a violent expression? And I think there are few optimists among us that this will be resolved anytime soon. Likewise, the continent away, and we'll hear this from the ambassador, in places like Mali and the Sahel, we've seen multiple coups. We've seen humanitarian displacement, counterterrorism efforts, and increasing ethnic conflict. How does a single effort at installing a peace agreement, getting the parties to agree, end any or all of those elements of conflict? And then I know many of us, including many of the students here, are thinking about new challenges for diplomacy. What is the effect of climate change today? How does that change dynamics between small groups that maybe used to have occasional tugs of war, now fighting over major land and having much larger conflicts because they've been displaced from their area, such in the Sahel, which we'll hear about, or fights over water or other resources that become more acute as climate affects our territories and our politics. So our speaker, as I said, knows this well. She has a 30-plus year in the diplomatic service. She currently, since 2017, is part of the Carter Center, where she is the senior special advisor on Mali, which plays a unique role in implementation of the peace agreement there. She's also associated with Yale's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, but I know her best from her time as a diplomat. She served over, as I said, 30 years in places ranging from Guinea, Panama, Mauritius, France, the U.S. mission to the United Nations, Washington, 2 years of the National Security Council, and of course, ambassador to Niger. She was twice a Deputy Assistant Secretary, both for Western Hemisphere affairs, and also for African American affairs. I fear we could ask her anything. We will not do that. A brief note on process. I will step away and invite the ambassador to give some opening remarks. Then we'll go back and forth a little bit over some questions, and then we'll open it up to those of you here with us in Haldeman Hall and those of you online for a deeper conversation. So without further ado, Ambassador, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Tori. And let me say, it really is a great honor, a great privilege for me to be here at the Dickey Center and to be addressing all of you, even through this screen. And there is one bit of humor. Tori, I was Deputy Assistant Secretary, acting DAS in WHA, Western Hemisphere Affairs, but I was not Deputy Assistant Secretary for African American Affairs. There are lots of Americans that think we need our own representative, but that's okay. But in fact, I was DAS for in the Bureau of African Affairs. So thank you for mentioning that. You know, you did have quite an illustrative list of former speakers, and that is quite a big challenge. But let me just tell you a few ideas. I'd like to share a few ideas about what I think about where we are diplomatically, what I think the United States needs when we talk about diplomacy. And then I'd love to start engaging with you on questions about what we think works and what doesn't work. But as a diplomat, over my 30 plus years really means 31 good solid years of being a representative of the United States. And, you know, when you're representing the US, regardless of administration, what you find is that basically through the long haul, our policies stay pretty consistent. It's the measures that we use. What are the strategies that various administrations want to use? Who do they want to emphasize, or what do they want to emphasize? And let me tell you what I know really does work. What is always a success. Our use of soft power. In other words, we are really good at getting the word out about the U.S. message, reaching communities. Our American diplomats, more than any other country's diplomats abroad, in my experience at least, we have no compunction about meeting with everyday people, working with civil society, trying to explain from the lowest person on an economic totem pole or political totem pole to the upper echelons of power, what it is our country is about, what our own priorities are, and pointing out what we think works and doesn't work in our given host country. And that is a consistent effort that American diplomats make, and it is in many ways unique to us. But it's also an important strength because internationally, worldwide, regular people, regular citizens have come to associate the American diplomat with a reachable person and with a person who normally is unafraid to speak truth to power. And there's power in that symbolism, in that message. So that's one thing we get right. Working with civil society, going all over a country and not reducing our interaction to those who are in power. What I have noticed that we stumble on, we think we have great ideas. We explain them to our interlocutors. Let's talk about government to government mostly, that's in this instance. We're not real good at improvisation. Let's use a music metaphor, at improvising. So when we want to explain, for example, why we think a country needs to open up the public square and have more political discourse, allow for greater freedom of expression, and we hit a brick wall, or the leader doesn't want to listen to us, or he throws some more people in cells. I have not found that we have been agile enough to figure out, well, what are more ways we can be convincing? What else do we need to do to get this message across without intervening. Some people call that intervening in domestic affairs. I think that sometimes maybe I shouldn't have used the human rights, because I mean, we don't really have two ways of looking at human rights. So that's not an issue where we need to pivot. But there are examples, for example, in peace building. Tori and I have been talking a lot about peace building since I've been up here, particularly since with the Carter Center, dedicated to waging peace. We have a very special role. I've been leading a very special role as the independent observer of how the peace agreement in Mali is being implemented. But before that peace agreement was signed, in my official US government capacity, I was our US rep to the negotiations. And we felt it was very important for us to be there. This was, the conflict in Mali was real. We were with the international community and wanting to stop it. And the Malians, both the rebels as well as the government, were relying on sustained international attention to help them resolve this problem. So it came to the point where we got all the people all the signatories were ready, all the rebels and the movements and the government were ready to sign the accord. So the question of guarantors came up. Who's going to guarantee this agreement? Well, a lot of countries had been watching. The UN, of course, was there. But at that point, the United States sort of said, well, we care about this, we're still going to watch it, but we're not prepared to be guarantors. I understand we cannot necessarily guarantee everybody's squabble, that will back them up. But what I sensed, and I continue to believe, even though it's not only for the US, when it comes to being the bridge in helping to form the cement for an agreement after there's been conflict, we don't really know what we mean by guarantors. So in the situation in Mali, it has progressed in fits and starts, and we're at a place where things have slowed down. The guarantors, those who did say, okay, well, I'll sign up. It's not my country, it's not my region, but I'll sign up. They don't know what to do to implement it. So I think that that's something that the international community, that those of you who are thinking about becoming practitioners, need to think about. What does it mean to guarantee a peace agreement? When we look at Eastern Europe, was certainly not my area of emphasis or specialty, but when we look at what's going on in Ukraine, isn't that part of the question that President Zelensky is asking the world? Okay, what am I supposed to expect from the international community? What more can you do as you watch my country become decimated? Who is going to help guarantee our physical security, but our ability to sustain ourselves in a way as a sovereign nation when that's blatantly being assaulted? So this whole notion of guarantors and what that means, is that just money? Is that just reports? Is that an automatic commitment of blood and treasure? I don't think there's clear definitions about that. And I think it's really important that we think about that. Related to guaranteeing, not specifically peace agreements, but related to how the international community, how do we as a collective support individuals in deep trouble, refugees, people that are being persecuted, countries that are that are becoming failed states. That we do have some measures. We have the International Criminal Court. We have the human rights courts. Are we using our instruments that we've established as an international community fully, accurately, in a way to build something that is lasting? So I think those are some questions. So that's part of what we're not quite getting right. From the specifically U.S. perspective, I've spent a lot of time. I spent a lot of time on Africa when I was in the department, and now that I've been out, I also continue to spend my time on Africa. It's a huge continent. diverse countries, tremendous potential, enormous diverse populations, but a great youth boom that's happening. And the United States has not, in my opinion, figured out what kind of priority should we give to this region of the planet. So we don't, in my view, have a strategy that is really going to take advantage of what we need security-wise, what we need economically-wise, what do our businesses need, technology-wise, and understanding what kinds of relationships do we need to have with the governments here. So I think the investment in reassessing the world order as we've known it post-World War II to the new world order that we are seeing today. That's, again, part of this adjustment. I think we've been slow to realize how things are evolving and what should be the U.S. place in new paradigms that are forming. So those are some of the things I hope that we can sort of explore in greater depth. Is that enough, Tori?
Thank you so much. That's a wonderful kickoff to the conversation. So let me follow up a little bit with a few other questions. So you've had a unique way of looking, if we stay for a moment, in the Sahel region. Okay. You know, you were an ambassador in the region in Niger. You were in Washington as a Deputy Assistant Secretary working on this, inclusive, I think, in 2015, when the peace agreement was reached in Mali. And now you've played this role as an outside NGO person. So maybe two questions. When you were the Deputy Assistant Secretary looking at that peace agreement, did you have a clear sense of what problem that peace agreement was solving? I ask because you can read any article on Mali or the Sahel, and some focus on the lack of governance or the collapse of governance. Some look at displacement. Others are worried about Al-Qaeda affiliates and the military aspects of the conflict, as well as the traditional disputes in the area. Others worry about ethnic conflict and even genocide, or the whole regional destabilization. And so again, just was that peace agreement designed for the problems that it had? And then the second, as you look back at your former role from your current role, your job is to help the parties recognize what they, as I understand it, what they are and aren't doing to support the peace agreement, and then go further, as you describe. We've used the word peace building, but for maybe a broader audience is how do you make the peace stick, right? What are those elements that tie it down so it's not so easy to bust through? What would you say about now from where you sit, you might think of differently as when you were in the Department of State?
Okay, thanks. Wow. Well, actually,
or any piece of that you wish to discuss.
No. Well, your first question was actually two questions, and I actually think both of them are really important. You started off by saying, did I think, I was the U.S. observer, I was our representative to the negotiations, right. And did I think that the negotiations that were addressing the problem, and then later you got more, or did I really? Later, you talk about what are the specific problems in Mali. But let me just say, timing is everything. By the time we got to 2015, when the agreement was signed, so it's really like 2014, the negotiations are going on. I think they went on for like 8 months. The US government high-level concern about Mali was the fact that Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb had at one point latched on to one of the Malian rebel groups. So there was a partnership between them. And there was concern that Al-Qaeda was going to get a foothold in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. So when the rebel group that had first aligned itself with AQIM then detached itself from AQIM and said, okay, we'll go to the peace agreement. We're not trying to do Al-Qaeda. Great. But it's a vast desert up there. There's a vast desert. So the United States was saying, fine, you say you don't want that? You're not affiliated with terrorists? Great. We'd like to hear that. There's a peace agreement. It's on the table. So we really think you need to say, you want to prove to us that you're not with the terrorists, that you really, once you believe in the sovereignty of Mali, that there's one government here and you're going to work towards that. Great. To me, the biggest sign of that to the comfort of our government will be that you all become signatories. So your first question is, did I really know what we were after? Yeah, the United States was after trying to make a distinction between, okay, there's been a rebellion. The French have been following it a lot. We're in there. We wanted to stop too, fine. But we're concerned about Al-Qaeda. I think that's an important thing to understand, because the peace agreement in and of itself is, as you said, supposed to be addressing the problems of the Malians that were fighting each other. And it lays out in nice little chapters, here's what you need to do for political institutions, here's what you need to do for economic development, here's how we're going to deal with reconciliation and justice issues. But here's my big but. Did we, on paper, the agreement sounds pretty reasonable. Matter of fact, it sounded so reasonable to some of the actual drafters. They thought it could be done in a year and a half. A year and a half, this will be over. We can all go back home, be normal. And you've been to conflict places. Anybody else that's been to conflict places know that when it's real conflict, it usually takes more than a year and a half for everything to go back to a new normal. But at any rate, that sort of was this notion. We'll get this signed, we'll get it done, and then we all go home. So in theory, the fact that there needed to be greater political participation by people from the North in central government, and in a feeling that their voices were going to be heard, yeah, that's in the agreement. That should be in the agreement. The idea that there'd be services from the central state, health services, educational services, roads built, access to banks and transportation, that those kinds of projects would occur, and all of a sudden services would not return, but be installed in the area because they simply did not exist in those areas. That's in there. So in many ways, the agreement talks about the right kind of things, in my view. But the problem had to do with the actual negotiators and how committed they were to realizing these commitments, to really putting this together. And both sides acknowledge that there was great resistance, great reluctance, great frustration, that there was so much international pressure on them that they had to come to an agreement. And the international people kept saying, but listen, you're gonna have to have an agreement at some point. We're here now to help you now, but things are becoming really, really dangerous. Let's get to work on this. What we have found, that was, okay, so the agreement was signed in 2015, the big ceremony, signing ceremony. Here we are in 2022. And you've only had maybe 3,000 of the former rebel soldiers demobilized. All the rest demobilized and integrated into a national army. All the rest are still sitting around waiting. There's been no what we call DDR, demilitarization, demobilization, and reintegration, or there has not been enough of it. There has not been, well, there's a lot that hasn't happened. I don't only want to go through the litany of the bad things. But I do think that the problem that you're talking about, does the agreement fit the needs? If there were political will on all sides, I think they could have made a lot of progress. Is it, a panacea? No, but if schools could have been reopened, if health services could have been provided, if in fact they would allow for some kind of a regional council, which is anticipated in the agreement, so that communities that live in these far-flung areas can have sort of what we call a governorship, or like even a township council, that then can feed information back to the capital that says, here's what's important to us. If they'd worked on that, I think we'd be in a much better situation than we are now.
All right.
Yeah, I guess you need to signal to me when I go on a little bit too long, but
Well, it's a big experiment being able to see you. Let me change to maybe a different hemisphere.
okay.
You've also worked in Latin America, you've worked on Cuban affairs. What would you say in any of those settings are either one of your favorite assignments or one of the things that you thought that the US or you yourself did really well at?
Oh,
Sorry, changing.
no,
Didn't give you much
a
warning
lot of
on
good stuff. It's interesting for those in the audience that might be interested in the Foreign Service. Very early in my career, I also worked in Panama. Now, this, of course, is the 80s, and times again have changed, and timing is everything. But as a young, at that time we called them junior officers, but it's entry-level officer, I was assigned the opposition, and I took advantage of that to go all over the country and meet all the opposition parties, find out what they stood for, who was in them, what they were doing, and all this stuff. And it just so happened that during my first tour, the civilian crusade started really ramping up, and there was a huge civil society-led protest movement against the militarily controlled government. That was great fun because all of a sudden the spotlight was on me, because I was the interpreter of what was going on, as far as telling Washington, here's what they're asking for, here's what they stand for. So that was quite exciting. Then, of course, we had Operation Just Cause, where we had to re-stand up the officially elected government that the military had tried to depose or prevent from taking office. That was a use of tremendous military force. There's no other way to look at it. 10,000 American soldiers flying in to a country in support of the legitimately elected government. But my little role in that was I had already left Panama, but I was brought back for that operation because now that the opposition really was government, I was the only person that they really trusted, because they'd known me in their hard times, and they said, we really need you back here to talk to the American government that we've been so mad at for basically being in bed with Noriega beforehand. But so that I'm really proud of the work that we did in trying to help that country reestablish democratic rule, the confidence that they had. I've talked to some of your students, and I was saying that credibility is really the calling card of any diplomat. If you don't really have authenticity and credibility, then your work is really, really tough. Working on Cuba was a great challenge. Let's flash up to something that's much more of this millennium. Because I actually straddled the George W. Bush administration and the Barack Obama administration while I handled the Cuba portfolio. And the George W. Bush administration put a lot of emphasis on trying to reach civil society, constantly trying to do everything we could to signal to civil society in Cuba, we're on your side, we support human rights defenders, we don't want to talk to the government that much. When Barack Obama's administration came in, they said, of course, we're going to continue to reach out to the civil society. Of course, we still support human rights defenders. But that administration in Cuba seems to be lasting longer than anybody anticipated. We've got to figure out how to talk to the government. Let's just sit down and try talking with them and see what we can come up with. Not that we're going to give away the store, but now is the time to start testing the waters to see what can be the elements of dialogue between our two countries. And in a first go round, our office of the Coordinator for Cuban Affairs was able to come up with testing elements, like say, well, various suggestions on what we think could begin a conversation between our governments to sort of just change the tenor of our discussions, change the focus, and perhaps start something. So we made a first foray. We took a delegation down to Cuba to talk about direct mail talks. We weren't delivering mail directly to Cuba at that time. It always had to go through a third country. But we mentioned a few other things. Well, let's talk a little bit about increasing travel to Cuba, increasing the access that Americans want to have to Cuba. We made, it all got approved, but we mentioned a lot of little things. And in that first go round, my feeling is that the Cuban government wasn't ready for that. They weren't ready for us all of a sudden to be suggestive and give them options. So they were closed-minded. They didn't really want to talk about anything but the strict given agenda of migration and direct mail talks. But, a year later, we were much more successful. The administration was much more successful because I believe because we had paved the way, prepared the ground.
Fantastic. All right, I'm going to ask you 2 questions, and then I'm going to open up to the audience. One is super easy, and one is not as easy. So I'm going to go hard first, and then I'll ask you.
Okay.
The hard question is, so we think that the Biden administration, while it put out some elements of a national security strategy last year, is rewriting whatever they wrote, given, I think, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You've made a case that at the strategic level, we should be paying more attention, at least to the continent and all the countries in Africa, perhaps implicitly others in Latin America and elsewhere. So the harder question is, what would you recommend be included in our next national security strategy? What would be some major goals that you think that the U.S. would really benefit from embracing? And then I will ask you the simpler, easier question afterwards, which were you always intending to be a diplomat, or was your undergraduate degree in literature not part of the plan to be a diplomat? But first, on the serious one about national security strategy, what would you recommend?
That is a wonderful question. For which you did not prep me.
I'm sorry.
So I wish I could think a little bit more about it. But it's not because I'm an African American that I think we need to do more in Africa. It's because we're not doing enough in Africa. And I think there is a strategic need for us to understand that continent a heck of a lot better than we appear to. I really do believe that. I also believe that there's tremendous economic potential in not only in Africa, but in relations, in improving our relations there. What I'm seeing is that our competitors, who aren't always necessarily our adversaries, like a lot of European competitors, but our other competitors like India, like China, like Russia, like Turkey, are making inroads and begin on the African continent, and beginning in some ways to block U.S. access, to prevent, to work in ways that prevent U.S. businesses from fair competition, and to turn the populations and turn leadership's gaze away from the U.S. And I think in the long term, if you look at Russia now, if you look at China now, that will not be to our benefit. If China, for example, well, let me say that, but I think we need to pay attention to that. We need to pay attention to, if everybody else seems to think that these should be priorities, well, what are we missing? I also think that we have put a lot of, we're great on humanitarian assistance. I forgot to mention that. The United States is, superb, bar none, on humanitarian assistance. We have big hearts, we have lots of money, we have the logistical capacity, and if there's a huge earthquake or something like that, we're there, we help, we care. And then we disappear, but we are there to provide the assistance. We haven't thought long-term. I think we need to go back to realizing that countries are made of people. People need to be educated. They need to be able to understand, to be able to provide for themselves. We have stopped, basically just abandoned giving scholarships for like technical studies. We used to have all these graduate students in agriculture and food security and other kinds of, and pharmaceuticals. We don't do any of that anymore. Or as a government, we don't sponsor that. We don't have relations. We don't push for relationships, for example, between Dartmouth and universities in Africa. That we are strong believers in the private sector. Dartmouth is a private college. You can do that on your own. Yeah, you can. But wouldn't it be interesting to see if there was some kind of a way that the US government, in collaboration with private universities and public universities, could help and reach out to institutions of learning in Africa and say, look, we know you have a booming population that needs to be equipped, it needs information. We need to find a way to help that happen. It can only be a benefit. Even if all of those educated Africans stay right enough, it'll only benefit us as well. We don't think in those kinds of terms. We haven't thought about ways to use technology or to present our technology, to share our technology in a way that, number one, helps promote our better product, but also in ways that will address the climate change. Everybody talks about, why isn't there more solar power in the Sahel, for example? Why aren't they, because our system does not facilitate our businesses to get the loans they need, to get the private insurance protections that they need in order to really do good business. And we have not, we're a huge country, and we're a continent wide, right? We haven't done enough of the homework and the calculations to scale what we can offer to the 45, 50 countries that only have 10,000 people in this particular nation, or 30,000 people in that particular nation. So we're not creating the kind of initiatives that make it worthwhile to really invest in that kind of outreach. So I would focus much more on economic and educational policy, as well as reassessing what we mean by our own national security, and how the countries in Africa, the ports in Africa, affect that. We've been talking, one more point on that. With COVID and the shutdown and supply chain issues, all of a sudden everybody realizes, oh, we're not getting the special mineral that we need for our computer parts. Well, guess where that mineral is? Where are we finding most of the, there's a special term for it, but let's just say the precious minerals that we need for the technology that we use today. That's an important resource that those countries need to know how to regulate, monitor, be able to sell and make profit from. But we ought to be right in there too, negotiating with them on how to make all the regulations and the regimes for that as transparent as possible and as profitable as possible also for us. But we're not thinking, and now we're stuck. So those are some of the things I think about.
Thank you so much. Let me look around and see who here might want to be the first kickoff questioner. But while I'm looking for hands, I'm just going to
I forgot about the.
That's okay. I'm going to briefly ask. You don't have to go into a long answer on this. Did you always know you wanted to be a diplomat?
No, I didn't. I was a comp lit major. I loved literature. I loved reading. I loved cultures. I did comparative lit. But I stumbled into I stumbled into diplomacy, and then realized it was a calling. But I followed an ad that my ex showed me about the Foreign Service. And I should have realized he was telling me to take a slow boat to China, but I didn't think about it that way. And I started reading about it once I followed the ad, and then one thing led to another. So no, I didn't know.
Very good. All right. Tom, do we have a question? Oh, I forgot. Would you like to tell everybody what the email address is? It's dickey.events@dartmouth.edu. I'm sorry I didn't mention this in the beginning. If you're online with us and you'd like to ask a question, please write to dickey.events@dartmouth.edu. So for now, let me turn to the room and see who would like to start our conversation. The gentleman right here. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Samuel Pumareo, and I am a graduate student with the MALS program here studying globalization. So my question for you might be a little specific. It has to do with international organizations. Given the lack of enforcement capability, that we see in international organizations like the UN? How can we prevent a complete lack of faith in them? Thank you.
Great question. Enforcement is a problem, and I'm even having that problem monitoring the peace agreement, the peace accord in Mali. It's not that the UN has no enforcement mechanisms. It's just that that things have changed, times have evolved. So sanctions, the sanctions regime is one of its biggest enforcement mechanisms. The courts that we have, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, those are also enforcement mechanisms that take a lot. The naming and shaming that can happen either through sanctioning through the Human Rights Council or through special reports of the various special rapporteurs. We have special rapporteurs on many, many things. But yes, so what happens when you're dealing with a regime that doesn't care about being named and shamed? Therefore, should the international community, or more importantly, should regular people lose faith in the structure itself? My answer to the second question is no, don't lose faith in the structure. But yeah, the structure needs improvement. The structure needs modernization. The UN has been slow, reforming itself, but it has instituted some reforms. But you're right. There is. I was temporarily working for the U.S. government last fall at USUN, at our mission to the United Nations, and all during the first part of the General Assembly, country after country, and not just the African countries, Latin American countries, some of the Asian countries were saying this UN needs reform, and the first body that needs to be reformed is the Security Council. The Security Council isn't representative. It's not representative of the world as it's changed. There's no permanent African member. There's only one Asian member. There's no permanent Latin American member. So increasingly, the member states of the organization are grappling with how do we, through dialogue and discussion and initiatives, try to bring about change to this organization. And I think that discussion is going to continue to go on, but I think that the events in Ukraine, I think I've said this already, are demonstrating that it's not enough. It's not enough for the Security Council to just say, well, just hold on a minute, we'll get it together in a second. It's not enough. And I think that if you don't have the UN, you're going to make another international organization. I would hope that you wouldn't want to start really from scratch, because some of the doctrine that we have in there is really important to hold on to. All of the doctrine around human rights, that is really important to hold on to. And there's a lot of countries that would like to just push that aside. All of the doctrine, I think, about climate change that the UN is trying to implement, trying to enforce among states, is important to hold on to. So let's look at the structure that we got and acknowledge that some important changes need to happen. And increasingly, I think countries are going to sort of put this sort of either or, like, okay, we'll keep this institution for these things, but we are going to have to sort of shift and maybe come up with something that's more relevant to us for these others if you're not going to address it. And I think that will be at the US detriment, which is why our people, our policymakers, and they need to be supported by the American public, which really doesn't pay that much attention to foreign affairs. But our policymakers really need to do their own deep dive into, like, if we have to restructure our organization, let's look at everything that hasn't worked, as you've been asking me here, and let's see, in a perfect setting, what would make this work, or how can we make this work? And in order to do that, we have to talk more on a peer level with some of the other member states that we tend not to engage as fully as full partners with. We have to open up the tent and really say, okay, this has got to be a collaborative effort. Let's really put our elbows together and work on this together. That's something that we need to work on as a country.
Thank you. Good question. Let's see here. Over here.
Hi.
Hi.
We on?
Yes.
Nancy Carter, Hanover Citizen. It's an economics question. In the 30 years that you have been in diplomatic relations, do you feel that economics has played a larger role? I'm thinking now of the Russia's war into the Ukraine and all of the intricacies of, for instance, their oil policy and European nations thinking about where they're going to get their oil and so forth. And so it seems to me as though it becomes, in addition to diplomacy, it also becomes 100 large and small economic decisions. And I wonder if over the past 30 years, that has changed.
I think that there was a period of time. It's interesting because I would argue that even Europeans' consideration of where they're going to get their gas and oil from, that's not only an economic decision, that's a security. I mean, that, how are you going to prevent your population from freezing to death, for example, or how are they going to eat? So, so I just wanted to flag that. But I get your point. I do think that there was a period of time, but it was many, many years ago. It was early in my career, when we were told as diplomats, the State Department was told that the White House felt that we were not doing enough to advance trade, U.S. trade and U.S. businesses. But there's a lot of diplomacy that deals with economic issues. How much those issues are going to be the deciding factors in a policy really depends on what we're talking about. So you mentioned Russia or China. Remember, Nixon's overture to China had to do like, we can't let this market, yes, we want them to open up as a political polity, but we also want access to that market. It really depends on what an administration, views as that priority for that particular country. India, we have important economic relations with India, for example, and zillions of American call centers are located over there, and all kinds of, not all kinds, but there's there's all kinds of exchanges economically also with India. I guess the closest place we can think of where that kind of thing would happen on the continent of Africa would be South Africa. And there has been, there's no concern there. I mean, there's no comparison in the amount of economic attention that we give to South Africa vice what we're giving to some other places. Now, that said, sometimes private entities, if you'll remember this, you might remember the Sullivan Principles. I'm not sure if the Dartmouth students have really heard about it, but the Sullivan Principles that came up during apartheid in South Africa were all about economic policy, but they were created, fomented, advocated by private individuals, by actually a Reverend Leon Sullivan. Is that right? And he was able eventually to convince the U.S. government to support his own campaign on how to open up the economic field so that Black South Africans could participate in South Africa's economy. So I think that over time, economic policy issues, yes, they have taken a larger role. We paid much more attention to them than we did years ago. And I think they will continue to play an important role in how we make our policy decisions. I don't think it's good enough, though, for us to let them necessarily rule the day. For example, Um, if our relationship, maybe we could look at our relationship with Saudi Arabia that has a lot to do with economic issues and oil and the oil market. Do we let the relationship we have on the economic side with them overshadow what we know to be gross human rights and injustices, human rights violations committed by members of that government? That's an open question.
Thanks. Right here. And then we'll do right here and then Ao.
Hey, my name's Max Bessler. I'm a Dartmouth senior.
Hi,
I had,
Mac.
I had a quick question, given your long career, how you've both been in rooms where decisions are made in DC versus where those decisions are carried out in the field around the world. Can you just compare the type of person and the type of people that you meet in those two rooms? What draws someone to a career in those DC rooms versus what draws someone to a career in those faraway places?
That's an interesting question. Since I was never a political appointee, I'm not sure I can really accurately answer the first question. Although I will tell you this, there's such a thing as a presidential, what do they call them? They're not interns, but there are ways that you can sort of you can become a political appointee and get a position. You just catapult yourself into the department, much to the chagrin of the career officers. But in policy making positions, I forget what they're called. But they're usually people right out of graduate school, who know they want to have a public service job, and who somehow have a connection. They can get a good policy job, and that happens not just in the State Department, but all over. So that's one way if you don't want to really work yourself up through the ranks, and be in public service. So I do want to talk about the difference between the two rooms, but not in the way you're talking about it. So I'll get to that in a second. As far as the kind of person that decides, oh, I want to join the Foreign Service, sometimes you have accidents like me that stumble upon it and say, well, I'll take the exam and see what happens. And you have other people who all of their lives, this is what they thought about. And they take the exam 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. They just keep taking it until they can get in. But it is true that most of us who are serving, and I really mean by 90% of us who are serving, career people, we're not in it for the money. There is something about the exhilaration of seeing that you can make a difference. If either you're making a difference by helping to formulate policy, or you're making a difference even as a consular officer in somebody's life, like you're reuniting, somebody's kid has been put in jail in Turkey or in France or somewhere, and finally you help as a consular officer. You can help either bring them the vitamins that they need because they've got to do, or the medicines that they need, or eventually help get them out or make sure that they get a safe trial. Those kinds of things speak to us, and you get great satisfaction from the service. And you'd be surprised at how, well, I hope you wouldn't be surprised, but I think you might be, how committed Foreign Service workers really are to just doing the work. We don't get a lot of glory. Most people don't even know about us, really. Like, what are you doing in embassy? Oh, you're over there drinking cocktails? No, not all the time anyway. And we're living in real hardship. I mean, I had a 1-year-old baby. We didn't have water for a week. We didn't have electricity. We had a generator that wasn't working. I forgot to put his diapers in the air freight. So it was like, but you go and you serve, and you just do your best because it's thrilling, because you're taking part of history. You're being a part of history because you do love your country, and you do get to see what kind of an effect you can have. So I think those are the things that really seduce people to try to join the Foreign Service. It's exciting. You change every 3 or 4 years, so it never gets boring. You meet some of the most brilliant people in government in high places that you necessarily wouldn't have access to. And you really get either to spar with them on ideas or sit down and really consult with them. Americans, as you can see, we talk a lot, we share a lot, we're pretty open. And we like to get things done. So that aspect of the American diplomat is fun and highly regarded overseas.
Thank you. Back here, Ao. And then we'll go here.
Thank you very much. And my name is Ayo Koli. I'm a faculty member in African Studies and in comparative literature
Okay.
at Dartmouth. So I have a question about cultural negotiations, right? Because of course, as an ambassador, you go in with your own cultural norms and cultural sensitivities. And I'm curious how you negotiate potentially culturally sensitive issues on the ground, right? So for instance, being in the Sahel, in places like Mali, in places like Niger, where you have some issues around gender. Let's say, for instance,
Absolutely.
of the issue of female genital cutting, right? Which, I mean, I have to say, you have feminist organizations on the ground, Nigerian or Malian feminist organizations, who have been fighting those issues, but yet the government, in a certain way, is not on side of the feminist organization and is very much demonizing those feminist organizations. Another issue, burning issue on the African continent, especially in West Africa, has to be with LGBTQ rights, right? Where you have LGBTQ associations in those places, right? Working underground and often actually asking for support from the United States or from the ambassador of the United States, yet their government is explicitly, you have state homophobia going in. So as an ambassador, how do you negotiate? Where do you draw the line?
Okay, I'm about to sneak. Those are excellent questions, so thank you. It's nice to see a comparative literature person there. I'll say this. Fortunately, you named 2 issues that the United States is pretty outspoken about overseas everywhere. FGM, female genital mutilation. We had programs, we had initiatives in country, in Niger, all over, against female genital mutilation. And I personally I hosted imams when I was in Niger to talk to them about the practice, what we thought was wrong with it, why we thought it was wrong. It's a tremendous health hazard, and the subsequent complications that can come from female genital mutilation can lead to fistulas, can lead to women just being discarded, left, shunned by their families, shunned by their in-laws, and just left to live in miserable conditions and unhealthy conditions, plus increased maternal mortality, increased child mortality. So the US works on those issues, and we work with midwives. We have, you made a reference to local NGOs that might be being persecuted. I haven't read about that recently, but I'd love to find out more, and I'll certainly bring it to whoever's attention I could. But your larger point, if you're not just saying, well, the UN in general, a lot of countries, you're right, won't touch what they consider to be the sensitive issues. For example, slavery. You didn't mention caste-based slavery. That's something too that still goes on in Niger, although it's officially abolished and there have been court cases about it. It still goes on. It still goes on in Mali. It still goes on in Mauritania. All these places have on the books that it's illegal, but some are more aggressive than others in trying to do anything about it. And when I tried to talk to some of my ambassadorial counterparts in Niger, I'll do one story at a time. The Chinese diplomat said, look, there's only 5,000 of them. After a while, it's going to go away. And I said, yeah, but those are 5,000 enslaved people. That's 5,000 too many. And the whole argument that the adoption of the argument that, well, this is generational, they know nothing else, they wouldn't even know what to do if you were to set them free. The same kinds of things that I'm sure were what the abolitionists heard right in the United States of America. So, but this is also a point when I was talking about pivoting. Hillary Clinton gave a Medal of Freedom, or I forget the exact title, but we had a Courage Award, a Woman of Courage Award to a Nigerian woman who had been enslaved, who had sued for her freedom and was granted. She worked with an NGO found out about her and they helped her. And then she sued for her freedom. She got her freedom and that of 7 of her relatives. And she had to take her case all the way to the regional ECOWAS court. But it was very, very brave. And she didn't speak French. She didn't even speak one of the main local languages. She had her own sort of dialect that had to be, translated and then translated and all that. But the point was, she stood up. She stood up to power, and people were to help her. Fine. So we gave her the award. She came to the United States. She went back home. She there was in her own court case, I think she got the equivalent of like $20,000, which of course would go a long way. It won't set you up for life, but it'll go you a long way. But what I raised this story to say that, yeah, we were advocating for the right thing. But then we don't really have any programs that deal with, it isn't easy to make such a big transition. Is there more that we should be thinking about? I mean, should the United States use, is that called a waste, its funds to try to figure out programs to deal specifically with how you help people transition from a psychology, a mentality of bondage and dependency to independence? It's not that easy. It's not like breaking out of jail, where you've had a normal life and then you can just go. No, this is a new world for some people who'd never even been off their family compound. So we don't think about what are the repercussions, what's the aftermath of some of our great ideas. So that's a narrow case. It's like I said, it's not all over the country. It's not widespread. In Niger, we were talking, all right, it's 5,000 people, fine. But in larger issues, like for LGBTQ issues, or for FGM issues, as I said, we are advocates. We work with NGOs. We hold events where we make it very public, where not only the people are welcome, where we have speakers, we connect them to other American NGOs. So I feel like we've been on the right side of those arguments and on those initiatives. I had the unfortunate, but your issue of cultural sensitivity in Niger, you had philosophically a progressive government, at least in the president, in the top echelon. But I went to visit the minister of like women, the family and children, or something like that, because we had a very small amount of money that we wanted to contribute for a program on spacing to help women have more control over their reproductive rights, and just to talk about spacing and educate people. Fine. And the minister she said, I've got to tell you, we know this is a good program, but I'm afraid to take it. We don't want it. And I said, what do you mean you don't want it? Yeah, of course. He said, we don't want it because the Marabout visited me and he said he's going to cast a spell on me if I accept this money. Now, this is an educated minister whose president has told her, this is our policy. We want to support girls' education. We want to support reproductive rights. We want to support, this was number one, this was a small program, but I mean, and the minister wasn't going to implement some of this stuff because she was culturally afraid of the repercussions, where even if he wasn't going to cast a spell, was he going to do other kinds of things to damage her reputation? Now, I of course let her know that I thought that was not, that her position was untenable, but I don't have the influence between her and her Marabout, right? I did take that same story though back to the president. I said, you've got to look at your cabinet. If this is really going to be your policy, then you got to figure out how to get it implemented, because you can't have ministry people who are afraid. And if they're afraid, then and there were reasons. A Marabout can be a respected member of the community, and he can't, if he's not going to directly threaten the minister, he might do, he can go on the first floor and threaten the office workers, and you don't even realize why I've been waiting for this memo to come. Where's that memo? Why isn't it happening? And you realize it's because so-and-so's not letting it happen because they're afraid. Vigilance and helping the local administration, understand how to confront that kind of thing. They had to make some decisions, who's going to have more influence? Are you going to be the president? Is this going to be your policy? Are you going to let your cultural traditions thwart you? But it is relevant. It's important.
Fantastic question. I think we have time for one more, unfortunately, and I saw the gentleman over here.
Hi.
Hi, I've got you. I can hear you.
Firstly, thank you for coming and speaking with us today. One of the things I found really interesting and important in your discussion was this idea of U.S. position within African countries, and kind of how our diplomatic policies and international policies are affecting that, especially on the global stage with competitors such as China driving a really strong force into many of these African countries. And my question kind of is multifaceted in that, what exactly are our competitor, are those countries we're competing with for kind of diplomatic influence, let's say, in these places? Like, what are they doing more effectively that the U.S. lacks behind in, and what have we learned from them? What can we learn from our competitive countries? Because even if they are our adversaries, there are things we can take away to improve our own position using their tactics, kind of layered.
Your tactics, but I get your point. Yeah.
Layered with our own, obviously, just kind of, building on those. And then the other facet is, you just described how in this like caste system, slavery, when discussing it with other ambassadors, they said, well, they don't know any other way of living. And these are people from those countries we're competing with. And so there's this double standard of, well, they're trying to kind of improve the conditions there by giving money and gaining influence, but they also have this like backwards view of the people there. And so on the part of the nations, the people within those nations, is it more of like a kind of like we're looking for something different, maybe they will be better, those competitors will be better in comparison to the US, who kind of comes in, does the work, and then leaves without creating kind of infrastructural systems? Is it like we want to see if some nation like China will do a better job at creating a sustainable system? So thank you. Sorry, long question, but
yeah, but that was kind of a long one. So I forgot the question. No. So what are,
you don't have to answer all of it.
okay, I think I can combine. It's not so much, or what is China doing? China also learned from us. China has taken some good lessons from the United States. And it realizes, to make the people like us a little bit more, we need to do more development. They used to sort of just come in and say, we need this resource. We're going to send our people in to get it. We're going to pay you for it, and we're going home. So now they're building hospitals. They're building some roads. So they are sort of toying with the idea of maybe we can also be a country that does development, whereas before they aligned themselves with the G77 and stuff, and so they're a developing country themselves. They don't do development systems. They're beginning to do more and more development work, which is important. countries need it. So I don't look at that as competition. What they also do though is when they say they're going to do have an economic investment, the Chinese they bring in a Chinese workforce. They give a big loan, so to speak, to the host government. They pay off people. They don't have the same foreign corrupt practices legislation that we have. So sometimes there's a lot of corruption involved with deals that are made related to China. But they also, if they are going to give a loan, they'll charge very, very, very high interest. The return is really high. So the United States, we don't operate exactly in that way, but we could learn how to address. But the Chinese will spend the time building the infrastructure that a country might need after it gets whatever the oil, the mineral, the food that it wants in exchange. And so without being, I don't want to cast aspersions, but without taking advantage of the host country, I think we could do a much better job of saying, you know what, we will do a big Marshall Plan-like project in your country. We will help you with rewiring your electric grid so you can take high voltage electricity and have it go all throughout the country. And we can figure out a way to do it with our money and with the World Bank and with some kind of organization with you. We have not been willing to look at the major infrastructure projects that African countries often need because we think they're just too complicated and too costly, and we don't see a plus side from it. So that was one part of your question. What we can learn from this. So I do think we need to do more infrastructure. We did it in Latin America. We helped, and we wanted to. We built the Pan American Highway. We chlorinated the water in Panama. Of course, there was the Panama Canal. We cared about that, but we did the whole country. They have electricity all through the country. It's smaller and all that stuff. Times have changed, but it's not that we can't do it. We did a Marshall Plan for Europe. It needed it. We figured out how to make the money work. There's no kind of concentrated effort. There's no kind of think tank that says, okay, let's just figure it out and decide who's going to do what. How are we going to share both the burden and the advantage and the benefits of this? Nobody's doing that when it comes to investing in Africa, policy-wise or otherwise.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the diversity of questions, but mostly I appreciate, Ambassador, your diversity of responses and the broad thinking you bring to this. And it seems that you are not done trying to sort through what works and what doesn't. And I hear embedded in a lot of your response things that universities like where we are today could actually tackle some of those questions. So please, everybody, join me in thanking Ambassador Beeson-Williams for being with us today.
Thank you. I'm so sorry I couldn't be in the room, but I really, really appreciate this. I have enjoyed my stay here. Dickey Center is doing amazing things, so thank you for including me. Glad to be here.
Pleasure. Thank you. All right, everybody, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.